Nebraska Governor Jim Pillen held a tele-town hall meant to answer questions from Nebraskans. The call lasted just under an hour. Governor answered 7 questions from the public. A former chair of the Nebraska GOP asked the rest of the questions.
Pillen primarily discussed last week's State of the State address, as well as what's to come in the legislative session. Tonight, the governor said the #1 theme in his State of the State address was the budget, which has also been top of mind for many state senators this session.
You got to get everybody to understand that even though the press tries to say that we're broke and we have a $400 and some million hole, quite honestly, we have a budget prepared that fills it in and will end up in the biennium being $600 million over. And we can have some property tax relief. So it's so disappointing when people are saying, so bottom line, we'll fill it in.
They all said no.
Earlier this year, just before the legislative session began, our Lincoln sister station spoke with several lawmakers who called the situation a structural budget deficit. The governor made similar comments about the budget last week in his State of the State address, calling the budget deficit make-believe.
Pillen also spoke about his relationship with President Trump, backing his stance on immigration. He also told listeners he's continuing his work on what he called the property tax crisis, as well as protecting Nebraska children and defending state values.